7-year-old Wren Calloway found the first cub half buried in snow, its heart beating so faintly she thought it was already gone. And by the time the sun rose over Cold Spring Valley the next morning, 17 more were waiting to be found. Nobody in Willow Bend, Montana believed a child could save what grown men had already given up on. But nobody in Willow Bend knew what Wren knew, that the valley itself was dying, one silence at a time, and somehow this little girl and a litter of orphaned wolves were about to bring it roaring back to life. It was the January that old-timers still talk about, the year the thermometer at Hal Rutledge's feed store cracked at 22 below and never got fixed. Wren Calloway lived with her grandfather, Silas, on the last working sheep ranch at the head of the valley, a place called Cold Spring Hollow. Her parents had died in a highway accident 3 winters before, and since then it had just been the two of them, a drafty farmhouse, 400 sheep, and a silence so heavy it seemed to settle into the walls. Silas Calloway was 71 years old, a rancher of the old school, the kind of man who believed wolves and sheep belonged on opposite sides of a rifle. He'd lost lambs to wolf packs before it was practically scripture in that part of Montana, passed down through generations of ranchers who'd fought the reintroduced wolf population since the 1990s. So when Wren came running through the kitchen door that January morning, cheeks blistered red from the cold, screaming that she'd found puppies freezing in Miller's ravine, Silas nearly didn't believe her. But children don't lie about the things that break their hearts. He followed her 2 miles through knee-deep snow, his old joints screaming in protest, until they reached the mouth of a rocky den carved into the hillside. And there, Silas Calloway, a man who'd spent half his life resenting wolves, stood frozen himself, staring at a sight that would change everything he believed. 18 wolf pups, newborns maybe 10 days old, tangled together in a shivering, whimpering pile. Their mother lay a few yards away, stiff and silent, killed, as they'd later learned from the state wildlife office, by a rival pack during a brutal territorial dispute that had swept through 3 packs in the valley that winter. She'd made it back to protect her litter before she died, but her body could no longer give them warmth. "Leave them, Wren," Silas said quietly. "It's already too late, and even if it isn't, we can't." But Wren was already pulling off her coat. She wrapped it around as many pups as she could hold and looked up at her grandfather with the same stubborn fire her late mother used to have. "Grandpa, if we don't, who will?" Something in that question, maybe the echo of his own daughter's voice, cracked something open in Silas Calloway. What happened over the next 6 hours became local legend in Willow Bend, retold at the diner counter for years afterward. Silas radioed Hal at the feed store, who called Dr. Naomi Ferris, the town's only large animal veterinarian, who in turn called 2 neighboring ranch families, the Delgados and the Ostrowskis, people who, under any other circumstance, would have seen dead wolf pups as a mercy, not a tragedy. Instead, within the hour, 4 trucks were grinding up the icy ranch road toward Cold Spring Hollow. They set up in the mudroom first, then the kitchen, laying down heating pads, hot water bottles wrapped in towels, and because there weren't enough bottles in 3 households, combined empty mason jars filled with warm water. Dr. Ferris worked through the night mixing puppy milk replacer with goat's milk from Silas's own barn, syringe-feeding pups too weak to nurse. By midnight, 11 pups had steadied enough to stop shivering. By dawn, 3 more had rallied. By the next evening, all 18 were alive, fragile but alive. Word spread through Willow Bend fast, the way it does in small towns where everyone's business belongs to everyone. Some people scoffed. A few old ranchers muttered that Silas Calloway had lost his mind, feeding the very animals that could someday kill his flock. But something else was happening too, something nobody expected. People started showing up, not to protest, to help. A retired schoolteacher named Ruth Acaffer arrived with a truckload of blankets. A young rancher named Tobias Reyes, who'd lost 2 calves to wolves the previous spring, showed up anyway with a bag of feed and didn't say much, just worked quietly beside Wren refilling water bowls. Even Hal Rutledge, gruff as ever, donated heat lamps from his store at cost, which everyone in town knew meant free. By the second week, Cold Spring Hollow had become something between a wildlife rescue and a town project. Wren, still just 7, took to sitting in the barn for hours, nomming each pup individually not with cute or cartoonish names, but real names, names that meant something to her. Juniper, Ash, Rowan, Sable, Birch, and a scrappy runt she called Copper, who became her shadow. Here's the part of the story that matters, the part that turned this from a sweet rescue tale into something the whole valley still talks about. Gray wolves are what wildlife biologists call a keystone species, meaning their presence or absence can reshape an entire ecosystem. When wolves were hunted to near extinction in the American West by the mid-1900s, elk and deer populations exploded unchecked. Overgrazing stripped riverbanks bare. Without root systems to hold the soil, streams eroded and warmed, killing off fish. Beavers, who depend on young willow and aspen growth, vanished. Songbirds that nested in that same brush disappeared with them. It's a process scientists later documented dramatically in Yellowstone National Park after wolves were reintroduced there in 1995. An ecological cascade so significant it even changed the course of rivers, as vegetation returned and stabilized the banks. Willow Bend, it turned out, had been living through the opposite of that miracle for almost 2 decades. The local wolf packs had been decimated by a combination of disease, sanctioned culls, and that brutal territorial war that had killed Wren's pup's mother. Elk herds had ballooned. The willows and aspens along Cold Spring Creek, the very ones the town was named for, had been chewed down to stubs. The creek had grown wide, shallow, and warm. The trout were gone. So were the beavers. So Ruth Acaffer pointed out one evening at the Grange Hall meeting, where most of the songbirds she used to hear on her porch every spring. Dr. Ferris, ever the scientist, saw an opportunity buried inside the tragedy. If even a portion of these pups could be raised to independence and eventually released under a state monitoring program, they could help rebuild a functioning pack, one that might, over years, help restore balance to the valley the way it had in Yellowstone. It wasn't a simple fix, and Dr. Ferris was careful to say so at every town meeting that followed. Raising orphaned wild pups by hand carries real risk. Habituation to humans can be dangerous for both wolves and people, and any release plan required strict coordination with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks biologists, radio collars, remote den sites, and years of careful monitoring. This wasn't a fairy tale where wolves and humans simply decided to get along. It was slow, regulated, unglamorous work. But Wren didn't need to understand keystone species or trophic cascades to know something in the valley was broken. She just knew that Copper, the runt who slept curled against her collarbone every night that winter, deserved a chance. The town split, as towns do, into those who supported the rewilding project and those who didn't. A contentious meeting in March nearly ended the whole thing. Tobias Reyes, of all people, stood up and reminded the room that he'd lost calves to wolves and still believed this was worth trying, because the creek behind his own property hadn't run clear in 10 years. That swayed more people than any biologist's chart could have. By late spring, 12 of the 18 pups, the ones healthy enough and wild enough, according to Dr. Ferris's careful assessments, were transferred to a remote acclimation site deep in the national forest boundary, under state supervision, to be raised with minimal human contact before eventual release. It broke Wren's heart a little, watching the crates drive away. But Silas knelt beside her that day and told her something she'd remember for the rest of her life. "You didn't save them so they could stay yours, Wren girl. You saved them so they could go home." 6 of the pups, including Copper, who developed a slight limp from frostbite and would never fully thrive in the wild, stayed on at Cold Spring Hollow under a special wildlife sanctuary permit, becoming something of a local fixture. School groups came to learn about wolf biology. Wildlife biologists used the ranch as an education site. Copper, gentle and battle-scarred, became an unlikely ambassador for a species most of that valley had spent generations fearing. It's been 6 years now. The released wolves, descendants of that desperate litter, have formed what state biologists call the Cold Spring Pack, and its territory now overlaps almost precisely with the old range decimated by that territorial war years before. Elk herds in the valley have thinned and grown more cautious, no longer lingering to strip the willow shoots along the creek bank down to nothing. Those willows have come back, not everywhere, not completely, but enough that beavers returned 2 winters ago, and their dams have slowed the creek, deepened its pools, cooled its water. Last spring, for the first time in 18 years, Dr. Ferris confirmed trout spawning in Cold Spring Creek again. And Ruth Acaffer swears, though she'll be the first to admit memory plays tricks, that her porch is louder with birdsong than it's been since she was a young woman. Silas Calloway, now 77, still runs sheep at Cold Spring Hollow. And yes, he's lost the occasional lamb to predators over the years. That tension between ranching and wildlife never fully disappears, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. But he's also the first to tell visitors that his grazing land has never looked healthier, that the grass holds moisture longer now that the elk aren't stripping it bare, that something in the whole valley just feels more alive. Wren Calloway is 13 now. She still feeds Copper every morning before school, though he's slower these days, his muzzle gone gray. She wants to be a wildlife biologist, like Dr. Ferris. She already knows more about trophic cascades and ecosystem restoration than most college freshmen. When people ask her why she ran out into a freezing ravine at 7 years old to save animals her own grandfather had been taught to fear, she doesn't talk about ecology or keystone species, or any of the science that would come later. She just says they were cold and nobody else was coming. Sometimes that's all it takes, one small act of mercy, offered before anyone has time to explain why it shouldn't be done. A little girl's stubborn love, an old rancher's change of heart, and 18 freezing cubs nobody wanted, quietly rebuilding an entire valley, one willow shoot, one trout, one birdsong at a time.